Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. You know, Duncan Jones is sort of, over the last, 10 years of now, is the kind of filmmaker who I absolutely thought would be an industry leader of British independent cinema. There was something about his style, even for the films that haven't worked, or have sort of gone, it didn't quite appeal as people thought they would, primarily Warcraft. But there was something about the style that he was bringing that I genuinely believe is just, it is a very bespoke voice. There's something very personal about it. He knows what genre he likes to work in, which is primarily science fiction, and there's just a certain nuance to him that sort of blends art house and mainstream. And so I thought I would go all the way back to his first feature film, with his 2009 with 2009's Moon, because Moon is such an interesting film, insofar as it's not, I suppose, because there's something about the throwback about it. It's funny because of all the references, Family Guy once did probably one of the jokes that I thought is one of their best of their program, where they refer to something called the depressing 80s sci-fi, and the sketch is all about this incredibly convoluted science fiction plotline that ends with a man falling to his knee. Oh no, a man shooting himself, and the person he's with turns out to be a cyborg, and then it just slowly zooms out. And of course that's exemplary of that era when you had the sort of, if it wasn't Star Wars or Star Trek or a mainstream big budget Hollywood sci-fi, it was going to be depressing 80s sci-fi where it's just, the company or, the organisation or the government controls us in some way, and it's to do with clones or aliens or cyborgs or, and it just had this sense of real bleak, like I say, 80s depressing aesthetic to it. And of course that couldn't last forever, but we definitely went away from that to some degree. We've come back more recently when you think of films like, I suppose, like Ex Machina, that sort of, again, embodies that sense of, not melancholy, but there's something a little bit off. There's something a little bit like, as you're watching it, the atmosphere, almost like the air has gone out the room once the film has started. It's not horror. It's something else. There's a different word to describe it. But, you just get that sense of sort of cerebral, surrealist, almost, tension. And Moon is definitely that. There's something so indie film about Moon. The fact that it has essentially one actor who spends the majority, or at least the first act of the film, entirely by himself, although you could also make the case that the majority of the film he is by himself, with the exception of one robot. And it's an incredibly slow character piece about this guy on the moon, because they've discovered something called helium-3 that deposits on the moon, and that that sort of rejuvenated the Earth's power supply. But it only needs one human to manage it, to crew it, and of course it's pretty expensive to send astronauts out there, so Sam Rockwell is this character who essentially has to spend 3 years alone manning this station until he gets relieved of his duty. And then it gets weird in a way that's just, unfortunately, I did know the twist, and it's not an ending twist. It's one of those wonderful things you might call as the big, having a giant first act twist. And there's nothing that comes after it. It is just exclusively a big twist that comes fairly early in the film, and all of a sudden you realise you're watching something very different from what you're watching. And I will have to spoil it because it makes up such a large portion of the rest of the film. But I strongly urge you, if you like cerebral sci-fi and you like character study pieces, this is such a good film for that. Like I say, there's something quite indie about it. The idea you have one, although you can argue two if you include the robot, two actors. You could almost believe it came from a stage performance, and yet there isn't really enough for it to be a stage performance because it's mostly silence. It really has the although I infer this, although I will put my hands up and say I haven't seen it, I'm just aware of its content, which is there's something of the silent running about it. You know, it has that same style of aesthetic, that same sense of isolation and what, sort of the cold vacuum of space and what that does to someone who's isolated in it, and how that changes you and affects you, and and what you prioritize in your life, because everything is about internal reflection and going, oh, who am I? Why do I do what I do? What does it all mean? And this is definitely within that mold. So as I said, and I can't really say much more now, so I'm going to go straight into the spoiler thing. So, fairly early on, we discover that our main guy, I want to say Sam, but I'm not entirely sure that's the name of the character because he's played by Sam Rockwell. So I'm sort of holding out on that. But Sam Rockwell discovers himself. And he finds a man who looks exactly like him, who turns out to be a clone. And then, of course, it turns out that he is also a clone. And that that, of course, the company decided many years ago that it was cheaper and more efficient than sending astronauts up every 3 years to clone a guy and then have a stock full of clones and then who last 3 years, die, and then they just replace with the next clone who thinks they're just starting their mission, and again 3 years, on and on and on. And there's something beautifully twisted about it. Beautifully, cruel and yet efficient. Because there is something about that where you think, well, that there is a logic behind it. That actually, if we're going outside of, or we're pushing the boundaries of ethics, instead of putting people out onto the moon, or having unnecessary missions to wasting resources for the Earth, when the whole point of this is to try and stock resources and create resources for the Earth, it makes more sense. And also because psychologically it's not healthy for someone to be alone on the moon by themselves. Instead of putting people in danger or in trauma like that, you have clones, and the clones think they're a person, and you knock out the signal so that they don't get live feeds, they only get recorded stuff sent up. And essentially you have that clone play the same 3 years over and over again. And there is something incredibly efficient and logical about it. But it's a proper Klingon logic where it's when you just push a little deeper into below the surface, it's horrifying and monstrously cruel. And that's what's brilliant about it. There's something so, conflicted because you think, because we attached to Sam Rockwell because we actually, we've grown to like him, and we just thought he was a normal person. Then we've learned he's a clone, but that doesn't change anything for us because we never meet the original character. We just know him. And then we watch him sort of discover not only that he is being cloned, that he is a clone, and then learning that decades have passed since he thought he went on that mission. Again, there's you have empathy amongst it because it's been built in you, and so therefore everything that's being done to him is seemingly horrifying and incredibly cruel, and yet from a cold machine logic standpoint, it's very efficient, it's as ethical as possible. It is a rational decision. It's very Black Mirror. I got a real Black Mirror sensibility about this, and it often makes me think about depressing 80s sci-fis, as even though they're not anymore. And I wonder whether it's quite hard to make a standalone feature film like Moon or Ex Machina or Arrival that people wouldn't go, oh, well, it's like Black Mirror. Oh, this is, there's something of the Black Mirror of this, and this of all of them feels the most Black Mirror, and it makes me question because I think that show is great, and I think it pushes the boundaries of psychological horror, science fiction, sort of future history, and sort of satire, and it does it so well, and yet it does make me question: does that sort of make people not veer towards making feature films that are independent and just original because the comparison? And I've definitely seen other projects that have gone, oh, that's like this episode of Black Mirror, and I think it's a shame because I feel like there's enough room for both, you know. And again, I'd love to see sort of because again, you can't have the Hollywood scale, and when Hollywood tries to do weird cerebral sci-fi, you end up with films like Passengers, where the idea is great at its core, but then it has to go Hollywood with it, and it completely lets itself down. Now, as I mentioned, Arrival is a great film, or Extinction. Is it Extinction? Yeah, Annihilation. Again, so it's not like it's not being done, but I do think there's something in the British sensibility that we can do some really strange, messed up sci-fi ideas that are really interesting to watch. And again, very low budget, almost independent in its sensibilities because it is a handful of sets with one actor, two actors, and it's entirely a character study. And there's these beautiful moments where, of course, you have these two Sam Rockwells bouncing off from each other, and sort of the strange thing about these two clones who should, in essence, either really get on or click or vibe with each other, and yet because one feels that he's about to start his mission, his 3-year mission, and one who's done it, so their levels of sanity are a little bit uncertain. It makes it quite an interesting comparison and of two different performances. Two different performances played by the same actor playing the same person, and yet these characters have such different personalities to them. And I think that, again, it's demonstrably brilliant. You know, Sam Rockwell is such a fantastic actor. You know, this is the kind of performance that it takes a high caliber actor to be able to do. And again, like I say, the psychological aspect of it also enhances that sense of uncertainty and paranoia and sort of cerebral psychological horror. Whereas, like, what if none of this is real? What if this is entirely in the head of the guy and it is just isolation that has driven him mad, essentially? And that's the kind of thing which is fun to chew over with this kind of storytelling. And I don't know, yeah, it's such a great film. And what a great debut feature for Duncan Jones. I mean, he is one of those directors who's kept himself quite... It's not like he releases a film a year. You know, I mean, you've had 4 films over the past decade, one of which being Warcraft, which unfortunately was his one foray into franchise, you know, Hollywood, big budget blockbuster that just didn't really work for his sensibilities. I mean, the film itself is... The problems aren't to do with an incompatibility between him and the production. The problems are very different. But I'd much rather see Duncan Jones go and do his own independent filmmaking, because I think he has such a fascinating eye, and I'd love to see a plethora of science fiction concepts done from him, or other genres if something took his fancy, you know. But I'd love to see him being almost like the Richard Curtis of science fiction, or the Edgar Wright of science. Although Edgar Wright, of course, forays into multiple different genres. But again, these are sort of the figures I want to be able to point to and go, these redefined modern British cinema. But hey, still making films. I'm looking forward to seeing more of his back catalogue. But this is such a good film. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, please comment below, share the video, and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel to get notifications of when, and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of so close to 200. We are very, very close, guys. Videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.